Hey, all you Ethicuties and the 40% of you who have still not subscribed to the Ethicsverse, welcome to the coolest place to be every Thursday at noon Eastern. We got a special guest today. It's Bring Your Dog to Work Day here at the Ethicsverse. And so here's Stanley Tucci, my little puppy. We got a great topic today, hottest topics in E&C and HR. So keep those comments coming. As I go through my announcements, as always, drop your LinkedIn URL in the chat. Your network is your net worth. Neither are big enough. So connect with someone today. We have this great resource in this amazing community that we're all a part of. And you get no bonus points in life for reinventing the wheel. So connect with someone today and take advantage of this thing that we're all a part of. Hit this Ethicsverse survey if you have not. We would really appreciate your feedback, good, bad, or indifferent. No, keep the indifferent out, please. Good or bad, how can we improve? We take very seriously this hour you spend with us every single week, and we want to make it better. A lot of great resources out there. The podcast, these are the podcasts that I have in rotation. If you have not checked out the Compliance Leaders Lounge, check that out. If you have not checked out the Great Women in Compliance podcast, absolutely check that out. That's phenomenal. And the newest episode just dropped for the FCPA Survival Guide with me and Tom. So episode 8 is out there right now. If you want to check any of these out, take a picture of this QR code and you can see that. So I just mentioned the FCPA Survival Guide. That book is live on Amazon. So grab that if you haven't had the chance, or just listen to the podcast, okay? Listen to the 8-part podcast series, each about 10 minutes long. Check that out. The Ethico ecosystem is in full effect. So if you are sick of working in an old tool that hasn't been updated in 10 years, you're sick of all the clicks and all the manual entry, and you want to just take a glimpse at what a new tool would look like and see some of the results that you might be able to generate with something that's actually, generated this decade, give us a call for a no-pitch demo. A year of free service is still available for Ethicsverse members. So if you'd like to take advantage of that, subscribe to the Ethicsverse. You should see a sign-up sheet. And as always, we don't even like making money around here. We just like giving away books. So we're giving away 5 copies of the FCPA Survival Guide or any other book in the Ethicsverse library to those who have the best questions, best contributions, best comments in the chat. So keep those comments coming. We're giving away 5 of these babies today. And get ready, y'all. And now, where's the drum roll? Where's the drum roll music? We are announcing the Ethicsverse Day giveaway winners. Who loves you? Look at all these winners here. We got 30 winners. These are for the prize packs. So please check your email, because there's going to be an email from someone from the Ethico team to get your address so that we can send you out these prize packs. And the other 50 book winners will also be notified as well. Okay. So with that, we can move on and dive into the topics. I'm Nick. How's it going? I have my eye on you today. I'm Chief Servant and co-CEO of Ethico and host of the Ethicsverse. We got the one and only coolest guy in compliance, Matt Kelly. Let's get this puppy out of here, huh? Coolest guy in compliance, Matt Kelly. How's it going, Matt? Round of applause for Matt. Let's break our record of emojis that we hit last week. How's it going, Matt?
It's going very well, Nick. Thank you for having me, and thank you for your shameless pandering to the dog-loving community within the compliance world. And yeah, I'll be happy to take it over from here. So for everybody who is listening, thank you for being with us. It is our quarterly analysis of what has been going on in ethics and compliance news. We have a lot. In addition to Nick and me, we also have Karen Moore, who is actually joining us from Berlin. Karen, welcome.
Thank you. Dankeschön.
Oh, of course.
Wow.
And so Karen is these days a compliance professor at Fordham Law School and had previously been a compliance officer at Unisys and elsewhere, and has lots of analysis and good thoughts to share. And we do have a lot that we want to discuss here. So as always, we have our lineup, but if anybody listening has an item that you would like to bring up and share with the rest of the class, just pop it into the attendee chat. It'll get passed on to us. If you have a question you want to ask, if you have a comment you want to emphasize, or some other issue. And we do also have a couple of questions I will push out, not in a formal poll, but just ask the audience, what do you think of this, that, or the other thing? But I wanted to start, Karen and Nick, with an item about a very interesting SEC whistleblower award, which can remind us that getting internal reporting right is still a challenging thing. So this whistleblower award was for $37 million, which, as SEC awards go, is a lot. It's not the biggest, but it's in, I think, one of the top 10. And as usual with whistleblower awards, we don't actually know much about the specifics. We don't know the company. We don't know what the actual misconduct was. We know that probably if the whistleblower award was $37 million, this was misconduct that probably happened a couple of years ago that resulted in a settlement somewhere between $150 to $400 million. So it was a big deal. That's all we know about that. But I wanted to zero in on what the SEC actually said about the case. What they did say was that the whistleblower first reported internally to his or her compliance team, and then the company did nothing. And in fact, the SEC settlement order talks about how the whistleblower was persistent in trying to report this internally. And eventually that led the company to say, okay, maybe we should investigate this. And then they decided to self-disclose to the Securities and Exchange Commission. And apparently the company, when they did disclose, didn't disclose a whole lot. And I'm puzzled by this because by that point, the company must have known, well, there is a whistleblower. They were bringing it to us. Maybe they've gone to the SEC, and yet still it led to this sort of incomplete disclosure, according to the SEC. What did the company actually say? We don't get to know. But I was really struck that there is still this difficulty in being responsive to whistleblowers. There's a difficulty in companies deciding, do we self-disclose or not? And if you do, what are we supposed to say? And whistleblowers clearly make all of that a much more difficult thing to figure out. And that's what I wanted to ask about. And maybe, Karen, I'll start with you and then go to Nick. But I was curious, like, what do you think about that the company wasn't responsive? This person had persistently internally reported. That was the phrase. And, how can companies demonstrate a responsiveness or a sincerity or an engagement with the whistleblower? Because I think that ultimately is what went wrong here.
Yeah, when there were amendments being proposed to Sarbanes-Oxley, the compliance community submitted, myriads of letters with recommendations during the open period, and really forcefully tried to make internal reporting a prerequisite to granting whistleblower boundaries, right? You have to exhaust internal avenues before you go and blow the whistle. And that really did not get incorporated into the updates. And at the time, I remember having conversations in the community, the compliance officer community, that, wow, there are these huge incentives. How are we going to compete with that as a Speak Up program? And make sure that people understand that speaking up internally has all sorts of benefits, even if it doesn't have millions of dollars in settlements. And do we even mention the fact that if you speak up internally, you can still go and claim your boundary, right? Like, it is really complicated issues. And to my amazement, really, people have not, to my knowledge, flooded to the SEC with claims unless they've felt like there's been no other avenue internally. And we don't know the details here, so it's really hard to say. But one small detail did strike me, which was interesting, is that this whistleblower with the $37 million bounty was whistleblower number 10. There was some comment there that several others got denied. Probably they weren't first to the gate, or they didn't have complete information or sufficient information, or they were too early or too late. I don't know. But there must have been an incredibly frustrated process internally where people were banging drums that just never got heard. And I don't have an answer for that. That's astounding to me in this day and age, or even 2 years ago, that a company didn't take things sufficiently seriously to try and satisfy the person who spoke up. I don't have any other words other than $37 million is only the tip of the iceberg for that company.
And Nick, give me your thoughts too, because I know you're always hot on the idea that this is not a speak up thing. This is a management listen up thing. And they didn't do it. Somehow they flubbed that. But I mean, what do you think about why this is still so difficult for companies to get right?
I don't know. I think it comes down to like a question of authenticity. I think the employee base at least wants to, at least initially, like take us at face value and say like, okay, you have this speak up line, you have this program where I can speak up and my protections are insured, so to speak. When somebody engages in that, I think it's on us to your point, like listen up and show that we're closing the loop. So like acknowledging, timely, just put yourself in their shoes, right? Like we've all submitted support tickets for some tool that we use. And I have felt frustration when it's like, okay, did you get this? Are you doing anything on it? I got to go and follow up. It's a much different experience when, there's an acknowledgement of receipt or, I get updates along the way to let me know that they're working on it. That feeling of sort of uncertainty is what drives someone to kind of get to their wits' end and start looking outside the organization, right? I mean, Karen said it herself, and I think even in the article, it said that like this person was like, exceptionally persistent. So like this person tried a bunch before they went outside for a compliance team that's over a program like that to let, 10 of these folks ultimately go to the SEC with no response. It's a little bit mind-boggling, but it just gets back to like, are we going to be authentic in our position, or are we going to get so jaded that we're really kind of checking the box, pushing papers around? I think this job is very hard, but it matters a lot. And this is, like Karen said, this is the tip of the iceberg. So being transparent with folks, letting them know like, hey, I got your message. Thank you so much for speaking up, giving them updates along the way. Those can do a lot to keep that person from reaching that point of frustration, that tipping point where they're going to go outside the organization.
So one or two comments here from the attendees that's worth calling out. Somebody who has said, in a broken environment, using internal reporting channels will get you punished or fired. I don't dispute that at all, but the key point there being in a broken environment, and that really gets to kind of what you were talking about, Nick. Authenticity in working with whistleblowers would mean the environment isn't broken. It looks to me like it was pretty busted up at this company from what we can see.
Right.
And the other thing that I think about a lot is we don't know where this incident happened. I assume this was a U.S. company. We don't actually know that. It might have been an overseas company registered here on U.S. markets. But with the EU whistleblower directive, you are actually supposed to respond to them. They submit an issue. You have to send them, I think it's within 7 days, a reply that, yes, we have it. We'll look into it. I think then you have to submit regular updates, even if that's like, we got nothing for you yet. And then an update at the conclusion of it, even if that conclusion is, we settled this and we can't tell you anymore. That there is a responsiveness baked into the EU whistleblower directive. But I just look at where this got the company. And like Karen, like you pointed out, there were at least 9 other claimants. So there were at least 9 other people looking for this. And the $37 million is the whistleblowers award. So the fine was at least 6 or 7 times that large. And then the legal costs and everything else. I mean, this must have been a huge item. I'm trying to figure out exactly what the issue was, what company was. Hasn't come to me yet. But Karen, here's another question.
Why won't they disclose that? Sorry to interrupt. We had a question from Debbie. Hey, Debbie. She said, why can't the facts be disclosed in this case if it's decided?
It is the law that the SEC cannot disclose this. I think because they want to protect whistleblowers rather than their name comes out. Maybe they don't want people to know that they just won $37 million. I can see the sense in that. And occasionally the whistleblower or his or her law firm will come forward and say, it was me, and here's the case, and now we all know about it. That is not the norm. But that is why, for everybody who's wondering, why don't we get to know all this? Because they want to protect the whistleblower's identity. And then it is up to the whistleblower and his or her attorneys if they want to jump out and tell everybody. But the other question I did have about this case was more the company's angst or deliberations over whether they self-disclosed to the regulator or not. And then when they finally did, they weren't as forthcoming as the agency would have liked. And I'm curious about how those debates happen at a company, what a compliance officer what should they play in that conversation? Or, what should they anticipate for anybody who might want to say no, and, where this could go wrong. Like, Karen, do you have any thoughts about how to make sure that process happens in a intelligent manner?
Strike intelligent. I think in some ways the DOJ and its extreme efforts, really laudable efforts to improve interactions with companies and give them the best possible opportunities to address misconduct, has created a little bit of a muddle about what happens when and in what order. The whole self-disclosure, the voluntary self-disclosure regime does become a bit of a muddle in terms of timing decisions, which may also affect, by the way, how you address an internal reporter, what they know and what they don't know, and what you want them to know and what they want you to know. So I do think that there's my gut reaction, or no, not my gut reaction. My reaction as a compliance officer would always be create a collaborative relationship with the DOJ. If you suspect that there's something wrong and you've been alerted to something that could be wrong, hop on it pretty quickly, even if you don't think you're going to create enough of an investigation trail within the reasonable time period that, this kind of undefined period of time you have to make a voluntary self-disclosure, which is not 18 months, but is also not 18 days. And then how are you dealing with the whistleblower, the person internally that raised the concern? I've had disagreements with general counsels and especially those with litigation backgrounds about whether you should be collaborative and whether you should go to the DOJ, and unless it's absolutely necessary, unless they're on the verge of finding out on their own, and whether the advantages are worthwhile. And there comes the muddle that the DOJ has created, because we've seen several decisions or non-disclosure agreements or deferred prosecution agreements where, despite failure to make a voluntary self-disclosure, there's been a relatively light outcome. And maybe we'll be talking about some of that a little bit later. But so no. That's the short answer, is no to my long response, which is I don't think that there's an intelligent process that's been developed for how to reconcile all these different strategic opportunities.
But that was a question I wanted to put out, in fact, to all the listeners, was just in sort of a yes or no, if you pop it into the attendee chat. Does your company have a defined process to decide how to self-disclose an issue? Do you even know whether they do, or is this something that exists in the general counsel's head and they make it up on the fly, or is it written down? I don't know what, but I'd be very curious to know how many companies actually have a defined process to decide what do we self-disclose, absent the pressure of an actual complaint and like, yikes, we got to do something here now, let's make it up. So if people have any thoughts along those lines and just want to pop them into the attendee chat, I'd be eager to hear what those are. And Nick, I don't know if you have any other thoughts about this as well, and this battle that goes on.
Yeah, I think my thinking kind of was influenced pretty heavily by Hui Chen during Ethicsverse Day, when this topic in that last session around dealing with regulators, whatever, she was talking about how it's really not this black and white question. And I think I've sort of thought about it in a little bit more of a black and white frame kind of before she made these comments. But she told this story about, somebody coming in and self-disclosing, and she was on, I think, the prosecution team, and they were kind of talking to each other offline and being like, why is this person even here? We would have never found this. And so she kind of talked about the, ultimately the arithmetic, which is what, Karen just alluded to, this sort of calculus you have to do, because this is really an expected value equation. It's like, what's the severity of the issue? What's the likelihood of getting caught? And what is the likely, reduction should we, self-disclose and get credit for it? It's just not this black and white thing. And it makes it very difficult because, again, you might be talking to a GC that has a different posture. They have that litigation posture, and it's a lot more perhaps Machiavellian or pragmatic or whatever. And the ethics of it all isn't really entering into the equation. So I think from your question, from a minute or so ago about like, what can a compliance officer do? I think the number one thing a compliance officer can do is help with that risk assessment motion. That's what we do a lot. We assess risks in different sort of departments and divisions and things like that. That same framework of looking at, what is the severity of it? Do we have clear triggers in place? And is there a threshold that we've sort of pre-established as a tripwire for self-disclosure? And then looking at, again, is there some kind of a standardized methodology that we can use in this undetermined situation to at least point us in one direction? I think the grayness of it, or the it's kind of this, it's gray, it's very it's very opaque. And I think the more work you can do on the front end to kind of set yourself up with what those tripwires should be, the more likely you can arrive at a palatable answer. But I'll just say, it's not clearly, according to the experts, it's clearly not anything you should just be raising your hand and self-disclosing. There's a strategy to it, I guess.
Well, and I just have a couple of points that I wanted to add. One is I wasn't really clear that the muddle that the DOJ has created is on two levels, right, of voluntary self-disclosure, because you have the company coming in with voluntary self-disclosure, and now you have this kind of amnesty program where an officer can come in and say, not it. Let me tell you about something directly. So we've got kind of different things going on. But the second point I wanted to make that you reminded me, Nick, about what the compliance officer should do, and it just to me underscores the importance of the compliance officer having a good relationship and credibility and access to the board, because ultimately it could be a question of you and the GC and the CEO all presenting different theories to the board on how to proceed, and you want to make sure your voice is at least in there.
It looks like from the attendee chat, we have more people saying yes, there is a defined process than no, there's not, although a lot of them did say it's case by case. But trying to string together what both of you just said, Nick, I loved how you said it should be a methodology, because yes, that's fair. We don't know exactly what the report or incident will be on any given day. But I kind of also see it as ultimately for big issues, this is going to go to the board. And if this was a $200 million, $300 million settlement, I assume that was something that big would go to the board. Maybe I'm wrong, but it would almost be that the compliance officer is one among several. Lots of attendees saying it's general counsel, it's outside counsel as well, a couple of others. They should all contribute. And my fear would just be that the board is going to exclude compliance, exclude people arguing about the ethics of it all, while the board is deciding what do we do with this thing that is potentially going to be upwards of $300 million in a settlement. That has to have been a big deal. And I'm fascinated by, I'd love to know what the fact pattern actually was for this case and what this case was.
Yeah, me too. And I have to say, when the board is trying to work on a defensive position, that may also mess up your relationship with the whistleblower, right? Because now they're in an adversarial position to the company. So it creates knock-on problems.
So the next big issue I wanted to talk a bit about was very much in the news lately is Boeing's new settlement with the Justice Department for the violation of its DPA from 2021, which arose from the two planes that crashed in the late 2010s, 346 people ultimately killed. Boeing at that point wound up paying $2.5 billion in various settlement monies, including a $243 million criminal penalty and a 3-year DPA. And then that 3-year DPA, when it expired at the end of, I think it was May, the prosecutor said, no, you didn't fulfill the terms of it. And so they had to go back to court. And while this new settlement, this plea agreement is not yet final, it now says another $243 million penalty, a 3-year monitor, a guilty plea, and extensive compliance reforms. And that's the part that I wanted to zero in on here, is that it looks to me like Boeing basically has to meld its ethics and compliance function with its product quality and safety functions, because concerns about product and quality weren't getting addressed, I guess because the corporate culture didn't really allow for that. And so the Justice Department in its plea agreement says this is all going to be integrated. That is the actual word they use. And I'm curious about how would a compliance program try and do something like that? Where would a company start? Interestingly enough, the deal also says that it has a precise number of how much more money Boeing is supposed to spend on compliance, $455 million over the next 3 years of its corporate probation. And I guess that's a lot of money. Boeing makes about $70 billion in revenue right now this year. I mean, this year is not a good year for Boeing for obvious reasons with all of its problems. But that's the backstory. Karen, give me your thoughts first here about how rare would it even be to have product quality and safety kind of integrated in with ethics and compliance? Or what do you think the problem here is that they're trying to solve?
Yeah, well, I think one of the problems is that they merged compliance and law, and I have that soapbox of, compliance being a business function. I don't think it's so usual for compliance and safety to be maybe tied together administratively, but in any of the companies that I've worked for or with, that are manufacturing companies, health and safety is a huge risk. Now, there may be a completely separate health and safety part of the organization, but it's one of the instances in which compliance would take health and safety under its wing, where it might not take it under its wing if you're in financial services or in technology, non-manufacturing technology. But if your core business is manufacturing and your core business is manufacturing an airplane or a spacecraft, I would think that health and safety and compliance are working pretty closely together, the same way that compliance may not own privacy, but privacy is an important risk for compliance, and compliance and privacy and cybersecurity are all going to work really closely together. So I'm not really sure how important it is administratively, except in this case, clearly there's got to be a much closer relationship, and that may involve some kind of administrative function in terms of reporting lines and budgeting. But I don't think here that compliance is going to be able to say, oh, but health and safety is part of our operations. It's not part of compliance and law. So I have so many issues here with this, as I know everybody does. But
my best guess is that there's extensive documentation requirements for airplane manufacturing. That's not a guess. That's a thing. And so I'm thinking they're going to need to really refine how do health and safety, or quality and safety and compliance, get access to that data to make sure all planes have been manufactured the right way, or cross-reference that to what complaints have we got that it hasn't been. And, it seems like an enormous data integration task, an enormous systems integration task. I don't even necessarily know who would be in charge of that. At one point, Boeing did have an Office of Internal Governance that was in charge of financial reporting and nominally ethics and compliance, but it was all one thing. And then in 2020, they split that up. So now they do have a CCO. I just don't know, would he be in charge of it? Would somebody else be? Do they even know yet?
Well, how do you do with the competencies required? So I don't think that you can. Maybe it's the way that a bank has a regulatory compliance program and a corporate, or should have a regulatory and a corporate compliance program, right? That are, kind of working in lockstep, but have different competencies and different remits. But compliance is, I always think, uniquely positioned within an organization to provide a structure for almost anything going on in the organization without having to own it, without having to be
exactly
experts. And so, the compliance program clearly fell down on making sure that on the factory floor and in the engineering room, there were speak up opportunities that reached the right people, and that people weren't feeling captive to their microclimate, and not feeling empowered to speak up. So I'm not sure that compliance needs to be in charge of safety and regulatory filings, but it needs to provide its system of making sure that the right policies are reaching the right people, that the right training is happening, providing platforms or oversight or input and equally importantly to speaking up and independent investigations.
Nick, give me
So it
your
doesn't seem
thoughts.
that much of a departure for me. I mean, it seems like we're talking about one thing. We're talking about like business quality. Like in my private equity days, I would see a high correlation between like companies that had like a strong culture of integrity and like business performance, or companies that had, mature compliance programs. All those things are correlated with business quality. And I think when you're making investments like compliance, like ethics in the organization, the direct line is really like less important. The existence of the thing and its ability to sort of circulate through the organization, pull information in, provide insights back. That's a very unique thing that goes along with ethics and compliance. And I think when we're turned on and we're activated, there's a lot of positive externalities that show up in terms of just, quality. And who made this point? Yeah, Bob Cohen stole my idea. So Bob, stay out of my brain, please. But he was saying that the melding of ethics and compliance with safety is quite common in healthcare. And, again, you brought up safety in the manufacturing setting. That's just a risk that was big enough to like have its own, identity or something within the organization. Zooming out more, it's just yet another thing that we have to get right in order to be a successful company that maintains its going concern status. You know what I mean?
Nick, it was interesting there that I was going to ask you for thoughts about how to basically reboot a corporate culture, because that is ultimately what Boeing has to do here.
Yeah.
And even in the plea agreement, it doesn't say the word reboot, but it mentions two different levels where the board and senior executives must demonstrate through their actions their commitment to quality and compliance. And then a separate clause, you don't usually see that in the plea agreement. Middle management must also be incentivized to show that they take this integrity seriously in their daily routines. And clearly the Justice Department is thinking about this a lot, because that's an extensive treatment of the subject in most.
Well, I don't know how we do our job without those folks. So we're putting our finishing. How do we do it? Okay, thank you for asking. So we're putting our finishing touches on this middle managers toolkit. Activating middle managers toolkit. So it's going to be a white paper with a bunch of other resources that are going to like address this exact thing. And I just don't know how we do our job. Like, to the extent our job is to sort of provide, gather risk intelligence and provide those insights back to the point of risk, regardless of where those are, which departments those are in our organization. I'm not sure how we do our job without like authentic participation of these middle managers. Like, there's 65% of people saw wrongdoing in their workplace last year. If you look at the NAVEX report or our report, that boils down to 1.5 to 3.6 reports per 100. So there's 65 out there, and there's a handful that are making their way into that central brain. And we also know separately that people are 6 to 8 times more likely to report to their direct manager. So either everyone's lying and there's not all this wrongdoing at our workplace, or there's a bunch of like reports getting trapped, as like Karen was alluding to, a bunch of reports getting trapped at that middle manager layer. So if we can't activate those folks and bring them into this sort of risk management apparatus that we are over, well, then we're going to be like looking at the world through a pinhole, and we're going to be drawing conclusions from a data set we're not even conclusive that it's representative of the broader whole of like risks that are out in the organization. So I think it's really critical to sell those middle managers. I think it's maybe 2 or 3 kind of principles. One, you have to sell those middle managers on participation. And so that sale can be done through like a carrot or a stick, right? Incentives or like threats. You also can engage in like some like competitiveness, which I'll talk about in a second. So you have to get them like engaged. You have to sell them, and then you have to make it very easy for them. So you have to make it easy for them in terms of like messaging going out, right? We have to give them the song sheet so that they can sing. So as part of this toolkit that we're making, we have like 300, 200, whatever, different prompts that a compliance person can send around to middle managers that they can incorporate, in their weekly conversations or their emails to their team or whatever. How can we make it really easy for these people to like pick up the axe and start swinging? That's one. So that's in terms of like pushing a message out. And then in terms of getting information in, remember that 6 to 8 times more reports are hitting these folks. Making it easy for them to get guidance, making it easy for them to, report on behalf of someone that's reporting to them, right? Like using a proxy form or whatever. Getting all of this information into the central risk brain, that's going to allow us to do our job, find these risks, help us see around the curve, and kind of extinguish some of these like underlying risks that can really, upend our business. So I think like a cascading communication strategy, to the extent that you can put incentives in place where that perhaps the number of proxy reports that they've submitted on behalf of their, the people that they're over. Perhaps that's a KPI that you can track and can be part of their annual review. But the fact of it is, there's a ton of risk intelligence out there that we're not getting, and the key to unlocking it is going to be activating these folks. So I think it's, good timing for this asset we're putting out. I think it's the right prescription, that second clause. I think that's absolutely the right prescription. And I think, again, the government is over and over again trying to show us and signal to us like what they're actually looking for and what they think it's going to take to achieve this high integrity organization. And so, I think we have to kind of take that input and see how we can get started to just start kind of on your middle management activation journey. You just have to kind of get started.
Karen, you have any other thoughts here?
Yeah, I do, because the conventional wisdom has always been, the best place to report a concern is to your manager. And then we fail to equip those managers with any kind of competency or tools to know what to do with that. Somebody knocks on your door and you're really busy, or you're, more likely than not to discount something or to justify, or more dangerously, I think, to try and handle it yourself so that it never sees the light of day. So, I think this focus on middle management is correct in some sense, but it's a much, much bigger challenge, I think, than maybe the DOJ understands in terms of equipping middle management, which is already the most pressured layer in the organization, right? They're answering up and they're managing down. And, to make sure that a manager's got all the capability to handle something that walks in their door, I think it's a big ask.
It's interesting. We have a comment here from one listener saying middle management is in a tough spot. Correct. Expectations are all about production and profitability. They hear noise about compliance and integrity, but it's not how the managers are measured or compensated, only how they are disciplined. That is a very fair thing. And a lot of people in the chat were talking about how you incentivize middle managers. Well, you can pay them more money for doing something good, such as handling reports skillfully. You could punish them for doing something poorly, which I worry about that, because that instructs them just to retaliate in a more skillful and subtle manner. And I'm not sure the situation is improved. But I'm worried more about the middle communicating with senior management, where the middle manager goes and says, look, we're going to miss our performance target this quarter because we have an issue that I'm trying to get to the bottom of, and I need to slow down the production line to make sure it's right. And that's a tough message for middle managers to give to senior managers, but that's the one that matters. And so I'm curious, how will senior leaders communicate? That's all right. When you tell me this, we're going to give you the breathing room. And I look forward to Boeing explaining or demonstrating how it can put that into practice over the next several years.
They could be a leader in the field there at the end of the day with $440 million to spend.
Well, they just announced a new CEO yesterday, so he's got an opportunity here. And they also announced terrible second quarter results. So he certainly has the motivation to do something different, because what they've done, that ain't working anymore.
Only up from here,
Yes. So the third issue I wanted to talk about, and Karen, you've mentioned before that this is something that's been on your radar, are these anti-ESG DEI campaigns. And we've seen them at a couple of companies. Tractor Supply Company was one, John Deere Company was another, where these groups organized on social media to say, you have a DEI program, that's terrible. The stock price may fluctuate and go downward. People panic. And then the company has said, well, we're getting out of that. And I think I have a lot of problems with the ethics and compliance message that sends, particularly to employees. But Karen, what do you think about this first?
I think that outside of your core business line, right? So Tractor Supply is supplying agricultural goods to their customers. Once you stray outside that, you do things either because they are required by law, or you do things because they are important to your organization. And I think that this kind of failure to really say, this is something important to me, as a company, that our commitment to DEI and to environmental harm reduction is something core to our business, and therefore we are not going to be easily swayed by any one stakeholder group to stray from that in the short term. I think it's something that so many companies fail to recognize when they jump onto DEI and ESG type initiatives, that they start down a road that they're not sure how far they intend to travel on. And I'm not saying that there aren't multitudes of reasons why DEI programs and environmental harm reduction programs are not important. There are, because there are numerous stakeholders involved, and there's the bigger society picture and the role that a corporation plays in society. But don't say you're going to do it if you don't really mean it, because if it falls under the first sign of pressure, it calls into question your commitments to almost everything else. And in this case, Tractor Supply, a lot of the noise around it was that it was their very conservative customer base demanded it because they didn't like it. But actually, it was really this kind of very loud activist that used social media bullying, which I think almost makes it worse, because you can see Tractor Supply trying to prioritize its customers, but to cave to social media bullying, it's really not very admirable. And I think they're suffering because of it. Their employees are unhappy, and I know they've lost a couple of pretty high level employees who quit over the backpedaling. And I think some of their customers are pretty unhappy as well, because they're saying we are not all conservative farmers in the middle of nowhere. We are a diverse group of people, and we're all over the place. And in fact, a lot of the Tractor Supply customers, I believe, are urban dwellers. So this kind of characterization of, these highly conservative farmers and farming big tracts of land who don't support DEI efforts, I think is, first of all, unfair to that group, but also not really representative. So I come back to something I've been thinking a lot about recently, which is how companies need to identify their stakeholder populations, and then they need to prioritize them in some sort of order, because you can't make everybody happy. And if you're not going to be focusing on the things that are important to you and make you as a company true to yourselves, you can't really satisfy any of your stakeholders ultimately, and sustainability of your business is, I think, called into question. So those are all my many thoughts on this kind of trend we're seeing, which is a lot of backpedaling of companies that jumped in too fast.
Nick, I saw that you posted something on LinkedIn where you were recently speaking with Courtney Nordrum about anti-ESG movements and what you're supposed to do with them. I don't know if you want to either talk about what she and you talked about, or your thoughts generally here, but where's your head at on the ethics issues?
So the conversation with Courtney was last week. That's on YouTube. If anyone missed it, it was really good. She's a genius. But she made this point that I thought was right when she said, this used to be called CSR. Now it's called ESG. The acronyms may change in the future, but like all of this stuff existed before ESG came out, right? We still had diversity programs. We still had, environmental commitments. We still had governance and stuff like that in place. And, she made what I thought was an important point. She said, I try to separate my political personal views from like what the business needs. And I also recognize that like I try to keep the politics sort of out of it, because all of this stuff is being done and it's going to continue to be done, whether ESG turns into a 4-letter word or something else. Right. So I thought that was a good point. She also made the point to say, like, regardless of what's going on in the, the general conversation, focus on A, continuous improvement, and B, kind of incrementalism. So like, we're going to continue to focus on quality. We're going to continue to strive, for perfection, even though that's not attainable, because that pursuit in itself is noble. And we just want to make incremental improvements. So that's kind of the recap of that conversation. She just has a knack of like making something complex sound easy and simple. And I think that allows her to get a lot of things done a little bit under the radar, so to speak. And so I think there's a lot to learn. Highly recommended episode. And in the broader conversation though, when ESG was first coming out a couple of years ago, I was really concerned that companies were just going to use this as like a marketing tool and just kind of greenwash their way through it. And I think like this is true in business and like in life, like claims you make about yourself will get tested. And so if you claim that you care about this thing, well, then there's some test that's going to come and you're going to have to kind of put your money where your mouth is. And to Karen's point, there's a lot of people, what's that old saying that my dad pounded into my head? Like, if you stand for nothing, you'll fall for anything. Well, like if you don't actually stand for DEI and you pick that thing up, well, then to her point, the first little bit of tension, the first little bit of, rough patch you hit, you're going to drop that like a hot potato. And I think that speaks to the inauthenticity of like a lot of these ESG commitments that a lot of organizations, again, use as sort of marketing tools to, become a stock market darling or to look good to investors or to get better, terms on their loan with like a big bank. I think those commitments are really hollow if those are dropped. And, Allison Taylor wrote this great book called Higher Ground, and she has been a proponent of like, organizations, if you're going to do anything ESG, actually do it. Don't say you're doing 50 things and then half-ass all 50 of them. Rather, it's better to do 3 things that you're actually going to do right. And like, if it actually mattered, then they would stand behind it. And the fact that they didn't stand behind it proves that those commitments were hollow, fake. And I think it sends like a really bad message, to Karen, back to your point, it sends a bad message to, the workforce, right? Like that's who they're over. Those are their the main stakeholders that they interact with every single day. It's really hard for, for an employee base to know like, okay, well, what's true and what's not true? Because 2 months ago, all we were talking about was DEI, and now it's dead and it doesn't matter. So what else can I trust? I just think it's better to just be authentic and transparent and like actually true. If you're going to do this thing, then do it in the face of the fire. And if you're not actually going to hold on to that in the face of scrutiny or, attacks, then don't act like you're going to.
It strikes me. One thing you had said, Karen, was that the company does not want to be seen as easily swayed by one stakeholder group at the detriment of others. And that's what stuck in my mind here, was that there was this alleged stakeholder group of customers or investors, but the ones who tried to wage this campaign online, they were deliberately pitting themselves against the other stakeholder group of employees. And really, when the company caved, it told employees, you're not as important as these other stakeholders.
That's right.
In fact, when people say that who John Deere or Tractor Supplies companies, who are the customers are or not, most of their customers are not actual people. Most of their customers are large farm companies that are going to buy 1,000 of these things,
Great
not
point.
4 or 1. And those corporate customers couldn't care less about this either. They just, it's just about price for them, which is fair. But then they don't wade into these DEI fights. I personally also am wondering, how often could this be a market manipulation scheme? I don't know if that's what was afoot here, but it is the power of social media, and companies would be foolish to ignore it, that it amplifies people's platforms. So if you have 1 or 2 people out there who are waving some sort of campaign and the company has a heart attack and a freak out, they may have just been suckered by somebody who's looking to make a quick buck as the share price fell down and then bounced right back up. But I often think more about, there are competing stakeholder groups, they have competing interests, and the company has to balance them all. And yes, ethics is one of those ingredients you have to include as you're trying to figure out what the right balance is. But I thought that sent a terrible message to employees that, we'll cave as soon as somebody looks at us cross-eyed on social media.
Well, I think a lot of companies try to act like all their stakeholder groups are equal. And I don't think they actually are in actuality. Exactly. Like when it comes down to it, they don't treat them equally. Like I get that your vendors are, stakeholders, and your employees and your customers. And like, there's all these, investors, there's all these different groups, but there's also a hierarchy. And I'm just telling you, if a vendor of mine starts clamoring, they get a much different reaction than if an investor of mine starts clamoring. And so I can't act like, hey, every single stakeholder, Ethico people, everybody's equal. We have to be transparent around the true prioritization and the true algorithm. You can balance things, I think, with transparency. But I think if you're trying to put something up that's not actually, real, it's going to come out,
Yeah.
And if I could throw something out there, which maybe is not a popular view, and that is that institutional investors, as shareholders in companies, have an undue weight placed on them in terms of their influence on a company. And I'd move them right down near the bottom of my list of people that I was prioritizing, because if you're a publicly traded company and you're true to your corporate purpose, the shareholders are already on notice of what you're going to do and want to do, and they can vote with their shares. They can literally vote with their shares, but they can back out if they don't like what a company's doing. But all of this pressure, this kind of anti-ESG pressure that's coming from institutional shareholders, I find really disturbing, really troubling. It's a really kind of unbalanced shareholding, I think, more in the US than elsewhere. But that kind of influence is concerning.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's a result of the incentives that have been created, right? The CEOs disproportionate, all of management, all of board, a disproportionate component of their comp is tied to stock options. So they have a direct incentive to keep that stock price moving up. And guess who moves that stock price? Institutional investors. Just like the private farming companies that are buying 100 John Deere things, these guys are buying thousands and thousands of shares. So these are the guys that they ultimately have to appease. I'll tell you though, there are certain CEOs that are like down to stand on their values and down to convey that to the market. And they get what they get as a result of it. The guy that I think is like, who I would like to be like, is this guy, Gary Decker, who ran, Australian guy. He wrote a great book, and he ran WD-40 for like 20 or 30 years. And he was somebody that really, truly took a long-term view. He really, and what he was able to create was a phenomenal culture where they had employee engagement at 94% across the entire company for 2 decades. That is like a massive outlier. But something he did is he would go to, those analyst calls every quarter, and he'd say, I'm not giving you guidance. I'm running this business over the long term. This is what we're working on. This is what we're prioritizing. The stock price is going to be where it is. And again, but like, he actually believed that. He actually prioritized a great culture over stock price because he believed this universal law of reaping and sowing. And if I do the right things over time, that's going to show up. And he was willing to kind of go head to head with these sort of institutional investors that could really, in the short term, change his wealth to a large degree. But a lot of guys kind of act like culture matters, and they act like people matter and all those kinds of things. But when it comes down to it, what actually matters is their stock options. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and it's short term. It's short term thinking. I agree.
So we have about 10 more minutes, and I wanted to squeak in one last thing that happened a couple of weeks ago now that I thought was interesting, was that Citibank was fined another $136 million by banking regulators for not acting quickly enough to implement compliance reforms it had agreed to make in 2020, when it was fined $400 million. And this was all about very poor regulatory processes, internal controls, not necessarily about speak up culture, but just being able to make all of the necessary risk management decisions or collecting the right data for the right reports, because banks do have an extensive amount of regulatory filings they make. But here they are 4 years later. And the banking regulator swooped in and said, look, it's been 4 years. You kind of sort of did some good things, but not enough. Here's another $136 million fine to focus the mind. And I'm just stuck on what makes it so hard to get things done. Karen, I'll let you start, and then I'll be eager to hear from Nick as well. But like, what is the missing piece to get people to galvanize to actually do things here and improve a compliance program?
I don't think it's a missing piece. I think that compliance programs, people maybe don't give enough credit to their complexity. There are a lot of moving parts. There are a lot of risks to manage. There's the people element, the behavior element. Compliance programs are very often maybe financially well sourced, but not always necessarily have the different competencies that you need to bring together a really sophisticated approach to compliance, right? Not the legal approach, not the purely internal controls approach, but kind of blending human behavior, subject matter expertise, the ability to identify risks, not just in a silo, but incorporated into enterprise risk management. And then you add in a company as large and as complex as Citibank with its scope of operations and its number of employees. So I have some sympathy, but it's only some sympathy in this case, because they have had 4 years. But what really astounded me when you look at this is that they now are being required to have a quarterly review process. Where was the quarterly? I mean, the compliance officer should be reporting to the board and to executive leadership at least on a quarterly basis. And that report, it seems to me, following the consent decree, every quarter should be like, here's what we're being required to do. Here's where we've done things. Here's where we haven't. Here's where we've kind of failed. Here's what we're doing next. We're on track. We're not on track. I don't understand why this quarterly review process is being introduced 4 years later, and why it hasn't occurred, and why it hasn't been really clear pretty month by month on some form of a dashboard where they stand vis-a-vis their consent decree. So I'm a little bit confused by that. I do know that the complexity of operating a bank and the technology that is involved is huge. And I also know, Matt, from thanks to you, that the spending that Citibank Citi has put into introducing new technology solutions has been enormous. You can't fault them on that. But anybody who's ever onboarded any kind of a system, even if it's a small system, it's the kind of amount of time it takes to configure that system to have some sort of an output that makes sense to you. So it's not just the spend, it's the time, the care, the understanding. And I know, Matt, you've also written on this fat finger error. That was something that technology should have been able to combine with human behavior and address by not just sending up a little red flag saying, are you sure you want to make this thing? But having somebody affirmatively write in 2 sentences of, yes, I want to make this trade because blah, blah, blah. And that would have given enough of a pause and enough of personal accountability and enough of a review, in that case, at least for the person to say, no. So the technology investment in and of itself is also not going to do it. You have to configure it. You have to incorporate different concepts of how it's being used. You have to understand what to do with the output. So, yeah, I don't think there's a single thing here, but I do not understand why just a simple spreadsheet of tracking where they were meant to be with the consent decree didn't save them from this future cost and frankly embarrassment.
And how are they not monitoring the impression they were leaving along the way? You know what I'm saying? How do you get to the end of the 4 years and, like, I don't know. I would like to think that I would be asking, hey, how do you feel like we're doing? Do you feel like we're making progress? This is not going as fast as I would like. How do you think we're doing? You know what I'm saying? Something. I don't know. It's pretty baffling.
What strikes me is that it wasn't even really confusion about what to do. They had a 78-page consent decree that it laid out in painful detail what they were supposed to do. And, so could you not have, like, internal audit create basically a spreadsheet quarter by quarter? These are the things that we should have done. Here's what we have. Here's what we haven't. And I was just astonished at the inability to break the organizational inertia. It's funny, just before we got on this webinar, I was on LinkedIn where I saw that First Energy, which is a power utility in the Midwest, which is cleaning up a domestic bribery and corruption scheme from several years ago. They brought in all new people, and now they're looking to hire a fairly senior person who is in charge of execution governance. That is, I guess, going to be that person's job to make sure that the stuff we're supposed to be doing is actually getting done. And they've created a dedicated role to run around the enterprise and make sure we're doing what we committed to do. But it's baffling to me that a company that big, I get it's complicated, but so are the company's resources. They have a lot, and it's been 4 years and they're still struggling.
I would love to interview that person about 9 to 12 months after they start.
The
see what that job is like. Yeah. Czar of whatever governance.
Find out what their thinking is. I think it's a very good idea. I just hadn't heard that phrased that way before.
Me neither.
So we are pretty much out of time now, but we covered a lot of ground. So Karen, as always, thank you very much. And I know all of our attendees, they've just been chatting away all hour long as well. I thought this was a great conversation. And Nick,
phenomenal.
If you want to take it home, this has been wonderful.
So one more round of applause for Karen and for Matt. If you guys got to come next week. Next week, we're talking about burnout. How's it going? We're talking about burnout, and we have Deb Sabatini Henley, and we're going to be talking about burnout. End of the summer, kids are going back to school. Things are going to be settling down. A lot of folks are feeling burnt out, so we're going to be diving into that. And then the following week, we have the one and only Allison Taylor coming, and we're going to be talking about ESG and governance and the state of sort of current ethics. So hope you can join us for both of those. Those are going to be power episodes. And yeah, thank you all for joining. See you next week.